Good evening, everybody. So, quick show of hands. Who's already growing white clover? Reasonable. How many about red clover? Oh, okay. So, and now we've heard from James. How many people want to improve their level of clovers? Oh, okay, excellent. So, I am going to, hopefully, there we go, take you through these sort of points. So why should we be interested? And again, there's a lot of engagement already in terms of legumes and particularly clovers. And I'm going to take you through other options. So we'll mainly focus on white and red clover, but other legumes that are being used within beef and sheep systems. Some more applicable than others, but just thought it would be useful just to go through some of them. And then options or how I'm seeing them being used in beef and sheep systems. And again, will be very similar to how you're using them here too, but just some ideas of how we're using them in certain places. So just to go back a step in terms of what is a legume, I love a definition. So the bits that the ones we're interested in is the one in bold, and we use them quite a lot within ruminant sectors. Soybean obviously is in there as well, and we buy some of that in. And as sort of talked about, what makes them a legume is this symbiotic relationship, this connection with bacteria within the soil that allows them to fix nitrogen from the air. So basically, as James said, it's the air that moves into the soil that those bacteria take the nitrogen out of, and it's part of an exchange process. So they give the plant nitrogen, and the plant gives them food. But as alluded to, when nitrogen is limited, they need to do the job. When they've got good air supply, they'll do the job, and they need decent nutrients. And molybdenum is quite important for that bacteria as well. And so certain soils, not many, but we also just have to look at the molybdenum levels too. So why should we be interested? We've heard very much about nitrogen fixation. From a beef and sheep production, and we've heard from a dairy systems, we're generally looking at between a 10 to 15% increase in live weight gains when we have high levels of clover within those animals' diets. And that's generally works for grazing and probably not as dramatic for silage, but has a similar impact. Where we've got legumes, we generally have improved animal performance. How that happens is that the legumes are more readily digested in the rumen. They move through the rumen quicker, they can eat more. So it's driving feed intake, as well as protein levels and energy, but it's more driven by feed intake. High protein levels in silage, so we're generally, in a red clover ryegrass-based silage, we're generally looking at 2 to 3% higher in crude protein than a standard grass. Some of those can go higher. So again, it's providing opportunities for people to buy in less protein and producing more on farm. I'm working with flocks now that are taking twin-bearing ewes, albeit in good conditions and in a house system, all the way through to lambing on red clover silage alone. So we can manage without any supplementation going into those diets. Certainly for triplets, we might need to put some additional protein in later on. In terms of sequestration, so clover-based swards sequester about 50% more carbon. So some figures coming from Natural England say within a grassland system, it might sequester 0.6 of a tonne a year. Within a red clover system, we're looking at 0.9. None of them are very dramatic, but again, we're showing this improvement of having clovers in terms of sequestering more carbon into soils. And how that happens is it's basically carbohydrates that are being moved from the plant. So sugars are being generated from the photosynthesis. They're being moved into the root, and they're leaking out into the soils, and that's where quite a lot of that carbon comes from. Different growth patterns that we'll talk about in a second. Improved soil structure. So both red and white clover will have good benefits in terms of improving soil structure. We've got to obviously have it good enough to get them to be well-established swards, but they will improve soil structure through how they root. We've briefly talked about diverse mixes, and they are a core part of doing multi-species swards and other things coming onto farm at the moment. More drought tolerant. I come from a bit of the world where we were brown from June, July, August and into September, And on some farms, white and red clover lasted until sometime in August. So they're not completely drought resilient or resistant, but they are more tolerant than grass alone. And that certainly in the dry of year of 2018 has encouraged people to look at clovers more. And why they're more drought tolerant is that water use efficiency is very driven by nitrogen. And when you've got a plant which has its nitrogen being produced right by its roots, it helps in terms of improving its ability to use whatever moisture is available. Benefits of the following crop. A key part of any arable or organic arable rotation, old school arable rotation, but coming back, and particularly red clover being used by quite a lot of conventional farmers to boost soil structure and also nitrogen use. And animals do like it. So there's been some work in terms of putting one field of grass and one field of white clover and sort of understanding where the animals wish to spend time, and they do have preferences in terms of time of day of where they want to spend some time in white clover. So they do, I'm not advocating you set up that experiment on your farm, but certainly they like it. So when we look at the different types of clovers we've got available, so there's a big cluster here, and some of you may have already grown some of this. These are generally annual, well, they're all annuals. There's additional ones in relation to the ones I put on the screen. So we've got crimson, balasur, Persian, yellow trefoil, and berseem or Egyptian clover. There's being sown a bit in cover crops. So some sheep farmers are accessing them through grazing off cover crops. Some seed companies are putting them into seed mixes to sort of boost the production in the first year. Because of the annual, they don't tend to stay around very long, but can add certain benefits in that year one. Sweet clovers, alsatice, which looks like that picture that's come up, so it's quite a pretty flower. Subterranean is another annual that if you read a lot of work coming out of New Zealand and Australia, they talk a lot about subterranean clover. It drives quite a lot of their systems. It's an annual that sets seed, so it's quite useful. We just don't grow very much of it here at the moment. Bird's foot trefoil looks like that. Incredibly, it was one of the sort of plants alongside ragwort, fat hen, bird's foot trefoil, they were very successful plants in the dry of 2022 in my bit of the world. The challenge is that not many things like eating it, and it doesn't tend to persist when they choose to eat it. So it's useful, but not going to really drive production systems. Vetches are quite interesting, again, an annual can be used, and I'll go through a couple of examples of how they can be used, and can be quite important in whole crop situations as well. Red clover, I'll go into a bit more detail. Lucerne, I have a slight love affair with lucerne. Sainfoin, less so, and particularly like white clover, so we'll go through some of them in a bit more detail. But you can see from a legume perspective, or clover more, or legumes as we include lucerne and sainfoin, we have a huge variety of things we can use. It's just working out what's the best one to use and whether it's going to fit our system and our requirements. So I'm just going to take you through some of the ones, or the more interesting ones I've just talked through. So vetch looks like that, so quite a pretty purple flower with a particular leaf arrangement. As I said, annual, a lot of people are using it in maybe a cover crop or sort of alongside oats, and grazing it off over the winter with the hope that generally it regrows into the spring. So quite a useful plant. It does fix quite a bit of nitrogen, but obviously is only there for that year really, and then has to be replaced. As mentioned, it can be used quite well alongside a cereal for a whole crop as well, so it's supplying nitrogen into that whole crop, so it's like a bicrop, so again can be quite useful if that fits into your system. Red clover, not as versatile as white clover, but could be used significantly more than it is on a lot of beef and sheep systems. We'll talk a bit in a minute about one of the fear factors attached to it is an impact on topping. So the advice was always not to put sheep on it any 6 weeks either side of topping, and that's prevented quite a lot of people putting it in. There's been a very sort of quick demonstration project that's happened last year to sort of suggests that at low levels we don't seem to have that impact on sheep fertility, so it's sort of helping people put it into more places really. As also mentioned, gene bloat is a big risk when we start to graze this. So yeah, transition, just like transition onto any crop or different crop, we need to take care, monitoring animals regularly. But yeah, it can be grazed, and some farms are as a grass red clover lay or as within a diverse lay. Lucerne. So I'm just the project. I was involved in a project where we were grazing it with sheep. So the sheep were lambing on it. They were on it, pre-lambing, lambed on it, and went all the way through to weaning in a very dry bit in the top end of Norfolk. But it is amazing when it is very, very dry how it keeps going. It will eventually start to fail, but it's green where everything else isn't for probably a good 6 weeks. It isn't necessarily applicable to all soil types, and certainly might not be the crop of choice in Northern Ireland with your heavy rainfall, but in terms of there might be soils where it is appropriate for use, and it likes high pH soils and it likes freely drained soils. Do not put it anywhere near any drained as in it's got drains in it, because the roots find the drains and just run down them and end up breaking your drainage system. So not ideal. The other thing from an animal perspective, the plant doesn't hold any salt in the leaves, it holds all of its salt in its roots, so you have to have salt and fibre available at all times. So it's a bit of a more tricky one from a grazing perspective, but on certain sites it is amazing in terms of what it can do. Samfoin, again interesting, quite a lot of it grown on the Cotswolds, quite a lot of European. There's been a recent European project using it. I really struggle with it because it's not very persistent, so it doesn't last as long as lucerne, but again, and doesn't like heavy or acidic land. So these two really like pHs 6.5, 7-ish. So again, only applicable on certain areas, but still can fix a lot of nitrogen. The infamous and very versatile white clover. We've talked a bit about that, and there's quite a lot on this slide, but in terms of what is the different plants and sort of how they can be used and what are the considerations. So we've talked through white clover, red clover, a bit about annuals, this sort of mention of subterranean, so something that could be of interest, and where that might fit in the UK is more as an understory in arable systems, so using it to sort of provide some nitrogen to that growing arable crop. And mentioned at the bottom, so how we can grow beans, peas or vetches as a bicrop silage. So again, reducing the amount of bought-in protein that we need onto farm. And a lot of people are using those sort of bicrops as an alternative to maize in marginal land. But again, it has to fit within your rotation, and some of them can be quite challenging to ensile and then feed out. Rats particularly like it. So some of these have been talked about, but I'll just go through them quickly in terms of what do we need to think about when we're establishing, and a lot of this is more, I'm really focusing back onto white and red clover really. So soil test, it's like any reseeding program or when you're trying to introduce new seeds into soils, we've got to think prep. So prior to that, we might have a bag in the shed and we might just whack it in, but ideally we need to do some soil tests in advance. We need to look at structure. We need to deal with any nutrients it requires. So we need to do some preparation before we get going, and the same is said for all reseeds, and with the other challenge of weed control. So there aren't many clover safe products out there, so whatever we need to do is to try and control weeds prior to that, accept them or deal with them with spot spraying, or a suggestion is to if you've got a particularly weedy field, put the grass in, deal with any weeds that emerge, and then oversow the clover in. Sometimes the oversowing the clover is forgotten about, but that's an option if you've got a particularly weedy area. Overseeding is very possible, particularly with white clover, less successful with red clover, and again looking at between 1.5 and 2.5 kilos of white clover per acre. And we have to be careful in terms of how we manage the established grass, in terms of maybe running sheep across it every few weeks just to get them to take it down while the white clover is getting going. As mentioned, we definitely need a very good seed bed, but we also need very shallow. It needs to be scratched. As soon as it goes any deeper than that, you have the risk of losing some of those plants, or those plants never emerge. And less relevant for white clover, but for lucerne we have to have inoculated seed. So the bacteria that live in those nodules don't always exist in our soils for lucerne. And I'm dealing with some farms where they're putting clovers into arable fields that haven't had clovers for a while, and so we are inoculating some white clover seeds as well, just to make sure they get going with that bacteria, particular bacteria they need. This is sort of supports what James said in terms of pH. So this is some old work in terms of, so soil pH is running along the bottom, so running 3 to 7, and you've got maximum dry matter yield up the top. So you can see for grass, grass is in the green line and clover is in the blue line. So there is this sort of benefit of higher pH for both of those types of plants, which is, we know quite well. This is also in terms of, there's a bit of question about if we are putting white clover into a reseed, do we need to put some nitrogen in to kickstart it? And this is some recommendations, which is not really is the answer, or no. In terms of no real recommendation for any nitrogen going into the seed bed for a white clover sward or base sward. And this is based on RB209, the section 3, which you can see at the bottom right. So in terms of, and we also have to sort of start to be honest with ourselves in terms of what does a good white clover sward look like. So the one nearest me is about 10% white clover, the middle one is 30%, and the one at the far end is 60%. So we've talked a lot about it fixing, white clover fixing 150 kilos plus. It does that when it's at 30% plus. If you've got a scattering of white clover in fields, it's not going to be fixing that amount of nitrogen. So we have, and what tends to happen is that in certain systems, the clover might look like this 10% one in early spring. It hasn't really got going yet. The soils aren't warm enough. It's not moving quite as much as the grass. Come late spring, it probably looks like 30%. Come the middle of summer, it will look like the 60%. So it will vary across the year in terms of what that clover's doing. But that's the sort of level we're talking about when we say clover swards. It's not just a scattering. It is, when you look down, it looks dominated by clover. However, if it looks like that's the furthest picture in the beginning of April, I would be worried there isn't enough grass, and grass is driving quite a lot of the yield. So we just also need to think about just assessing how much is there and adjusting our views in terms of how much nitrogen is being fixed. The image on the bottom left is what a white clover plant looks like, and the reason why it's very persistent, or can be very persistent in a grazing system, is it runs on stolons. So these the sort of horizontal growth habit means it sort of hugs the soil, and so if an animal comes and steps on it, it basically becomes two plants, and both plants keep going. There's a sort of, you can see this sort of imaginary root system here. So if an animal comes here and steps on it, or there's some damage that happens here, this bit continues growing and this bit continues growing. So that's how it maintains some of its persistency within grazing systems. The only challenge is that we've then got, and James alluded to different varieties, so we've got them by small, medium and large. Medium is probably the most flexible in terms of it can suit with quite a lot of systems. You wouldn't use, for example, you'd rarely use any small in a dairy-based system, and conversely you wouldn't use very much large leaf white clover in a sheep system. So it's worth considering what's your objective for that field, what's going to graze it, how do I need to choose the right variety of clover to match that objective. This is some work from Ireland in terms of when growth patterns are occurring, and this is grass versus white clover, and just showing that white clover is a lot of its activity is happening later in the season. So we just need to be careful in terms of our expectation of how much is really going to appear in the spring. The advantage of this is when you've got dry bits or dry areas, is it's providing dry matter production in what could be a lower area for grass, and that's why it's useful in particularly dry places. It helps to sort of spread grass and forage production across the year quite successfully. This just really quickly just highlights that clover also has preferences for grass types. It particularly does not like growing with cocksfoot. It's probably to do with how cocksfoot is quite aggressive and sort of tries to prevent plants from growing anywhere near it. What it really likes is timothy. So again, that timothy is used quite a lot in some beef and sheep systems. So it's also thinking of how we can match it with certain grasses. Like you can see the ryegrass here is sort of middle table, while it particularly likes timothy and not the biggest fan of cocksfoot. So it's just something else to ponder in terms of explaining why white clover isn't quite where you need it to be. So the bit that we need to focus on is we've talked about the top bits, but the bottom bits, which is the best ways we can kill white clover out of swards are overgrazing in the winter. And this is not about we graze it tight and then we rest it for 3 months and then we might graze it again in the spring. This is about nearly continuous sheep grazing throughout the entire winter. And what that does is, we talked about the stolons can sort of maintain, do you mean they can split and you can have 2 plants? But obviously if that's happening constantly over that wet winter and the soils aren't warm enough for that plant to keep sort of regenerating itself, you will get plant loss. And sort of and also undergrazing in the spring and summer. And that's to do, as James mentioned, it's to do with, I'll just go back, the leaf emergence here. So the leaf, to trigger this leaf to appear from this stolon, it needs light to get to that stolon. So if you've got a lot of grass cover, that light isn't getting to the base of that sward, and so it's not triggering this production of leaves. And that's why it's important that we don't allow this really high cover in the spring to allow the clover to get swamped out. And some of that, we sort of link it to nitrogen use as well. So nitrogen use in the spring is driving grass growth, and it's also affecting how clover's dealing with being swamped out, basically. So red clover, very different plant, so grows off a taproot. Its growing crown sits about 5 centimetres above the ground, so if you damage that crown by sheep grazing it or a foot landing on it, and in wet times that plant will die. So we don't tend to get any more, red clover plants in a field. It's how quickly they decline is the bit that we're managing. But yeah, generally drilled alongside ryegrass, perennial ryegrass or hybrids. In a silage system, we're generally looking at a 3 to 4 year rotation on that. We need a 5-year break before it's put back into that field. So we just have to think about where it's going next after it's had that time in red clover. In terms of lamb performance, cattle performance, some of the biggest growth rates are on red clover. So we tend to put red clover at the top in terms of what's driving live weight gain. We might have a plantain, chicory, diverse sward after that. We might have lucerne after that, and then we've got grass at the bottom. So it always, whenever there's any work on lamb growth rates or cattle growth rates, anything with red clover generally has a higher growth rate and speed of finish. Because it contains this phytoestrogen, it encourages animals to lay down fat, so you tend to get animals finishing quicker as well on it. So that's why it has its impact, or how it has some of its impact. If you're interested in just having a bit more of a read about this trial, so if you Google or look at mating sheep on red clover swards field lab, if you just Google that, it'll come up with the report for this project, which is trying to sort of say that actually we can top sheep on red clover or swards that contain anywhere between 15 to 30% red clover without having any increase in barren rate. I still think I would be nervous about suggesting sheep on higher levels until we've done a bit more work. But in reality, in my bit of the world, this topping, if people were topping for sort of Feb, late Jan lambing, there was nothing else on that farm than red clover. So we'll see soon enough whether it does work. So yeah, I think it's sort of, for a lot of us, it's sort of reduced the risks associated with red clover and ewe fertility. So this is just a couple of examples of what we would do. So suckler cows generally are not going to be on your precious white and red clover swards. They might do a tidying up job every now and again, but it's too valuable to probably be going towards a suckler cow system. We might be putting thinner cows on better silage during the winter to sort of build up condition. but generally it's going to be prioritised to your growing cattle and some of your finishing cattle. I know a farmer who is replacing some of his concentrates used for finishing bulls with red clover silage. So he hasn't replaced all of them, but has replaced a fair amount of concentrates with putting in some red clover and grass silage, sorry. So again, we're trying to get them, particularly these animals, onto grass with some clover, so they naturally transition themselves. So as the clover starts coming up, they're starting to sort of be exposed to more of it, and it's allowing them to transition onto these grass clover lays. We can definitely set up the worst possible circumstance for bloat, which is putting an animal out of a shed that's a bit hungry into a field with lots and lots of clover. We can guarantee those animals, not quite guarantee, but if we want to set up a bloat condition, that's how to do it. So it's allowing those animals to transition as the clover levels increase on those swards. And then there's during that autumn, the clover levels may be dropping a bit, so just checking in terms of performance there. Sheep systems, really interesting opportunities for triplets or young sheep to be lambed on these sort of high clover swards, particularly red clover. Again, prioritising sheep with lambs. We could be then shutting up we could graze them initially and then shut them up for some silage with some aftermath grazing for wean lambs later on red clover. And then dry ewes again won't be on it for very much, but could be used quite effectively they could be used to tidy up fields and sort of build up conditions. So then we could be moving them we could have options in the winter, so they could be on a vetch-based cover crop. They could be being fed red clover, as I mentioned. But generally we're trying wherever possible to not overgraze those clover-based swards in the winter. And the challenge is when we're starting to push up the amount of clover on all farms is our ability to have any area that hasn't got clover over the winter is getting more and more limited. But as I mentioned, it's not about no grazing, it is about continuous set stocking of these areas that we're trying to avoid. So if you graze an area, shut it off and move on to another one is the key. So, from my perspective, they need to play, and on some farms they already are, but they need to play an important role on every beef and sheep system. They do make management more challenging, but I think it's quite an interesting challenge, and sort of alluded to the amount of difference we can make in terms of margins. It's a challenge we all need to sort of accept. But yeah, we have to think about what the plant likes. We can't just treat it like grass. We have to think slightly differently about what that plant needs at certain times of the year. And then, as mentioned, these more specialist legumes have a place, but how do they fit into your system? Does it fit with your requirements? But there's a lot, as you could see, there was a lot of choice to choose from in terms of where you can go next. But let's perhaps concentrate on white and red clover, and then let's get fancier once we've sorted them out. Thank you.